see on your screen that the session which we have planned today is revised model GST law vis-a-vis the GST bill which has been passed in Lok Sabha. So the latest news about GST is that GST is now sure. It's going to come from 1st July 2017 and the bills, 4 bills are already passed in Lok Sabha. The draft rules which were there, 5 draft rules, they have been changed according to the bill, and they will be also clearing from Lok Sabha in next month, in this month only, that is April, and 18th and 19th May will be crucial meeting of GST Council, wherein they will fit the rate from the within the items, and for each item they will fix a rate, and along with that they are also going to come out with 4 draft rules and regulations which will be there in the public domain in due course of time for the public comments and all, and then it will be freezed on 18th and 19th of May. So we can expect that by the end of May, or maybe maybe within the first week of June, the entire law, rules, everything will be there with us. And as I have committed in the introduction session that we'll be covering revised model GST law, and when the law will be finalized, we'll be covering certain extra sessions and we'll be discussing the model GST law as well as the bill. So today we have kept an extra session wherein we are going to discuss the provisions which we have already discussed up till session 9, and then we are going to discuss what are the changes in the bill that is cleared by Lok Sabha and which is going to be the final bill. So my dear friends, now I will make an announcement which is very crucial. What we are trying to do today is, we have done 9 sessions up till now. Session number 1 to session number 6, it covered more or less, it covered the definition of supply, it covered time of supply, it covered an overview, it covered payment of tax, it covered registration, tax invoice, place of supply. Place of supply was covered in 7 sessions. So up till 6 session, majorly we have covered the supply, time of supply, tax invoice, registration, and an overview, and levy, collection and exemption. So what we will be doing today is, we will be trying to cover levy, collection, we will be trying to cover the taxable event which is supply again, we will be trying to cover time and time of supply of goods and services, and then in next session, which is going to be on tomorrow's session, we are cancelling because many persons have requested that in spite of keeping sessions in April first week, let us postpone for a few days. So what we have decided is, we will be keeping on 4th of April the second session, and in that session we will be discussing up till session 9 all the provisions we will be discussing which is there in the bill. And the only purpose of doing this is, we have recently gone through the provisions of model GST law. So if at this point of time we will go through the provisions which is there in the bill, it will be more beneficial for us. And therefore in last session there was certain requests and certain queries which were pending pertaining to place of supply, and there were 2 sections which were pending so far as input tax credit is concerned. So what we will be doing is, we will be taking up all those provisions in next session and comparing it with the bill, and in the same session we will be taking up those pending queries also. So today's target will be to discuss the provisions as per bill pertaining to levy and collection, supply, time of supply of goods and services, and composition levy. This is overall target of today's session, that we will be comparing revised model GST law and the bill that has been cleared from Lok Sabha. So now let me begin, friends. There are certain queries which are coming up, and I feel that we will be taking those queries because these are more related toward the towards the place of supply and the input tax credit. So we'll be taking it in next session, because there we'll be discussing the bill also. So when we will be discussing the final law, at that point of time all those questions will be touched upon once again, so that it gives more clarity and it is directly understandable, because otherwise we will not be able to correlate the same. So please friends, let me go ahead. First and foremost is supply, meaning and scope of supply. अगर आप लोगों को याद हो तो in model GST law the term supply was defined under section 3 and it was running into 5 subsections. Section 3 running into 5 subsections, but now it has been covered under the definition, under the chapter which is levy and collection, and the section relevant is section 7. The term supply is now in bill, it is defined under section 7. Number 1, it has been curtailed to 3 subsections only, and the 5th subsection, which was pertaining to composite and mixed supply, is now section 8. So let us discuss the provisions pertaining to section 7, which defines the term supply. I feel and I know that each one of us are very much aware about the definition which we have discussed in section 3 pertaining to supply. So please keep that in mind, because we are going to compare that definition and the definition which is the final definition which is going to come in GST. The term supply includes subsection 1, and there were 3 clauses. If you remember, there were 3 clauses earlier. Clause A, which was saying the term supply includes all forms of supply such as sale, transfer, exchange, barter, license, lease, rental or disposal, made or agreed to be made by a person for a consideration in course or furtherance of business. This was subsection 1 of section 3, clause A. Clause B was importation of service for a consideration in course, whether or not in course or furtherance of business. That was clause B. Clause C was supplies which are covered under schedule 1, irrespective of the fact, without consideration, will be treated as supply. So what is the change there in the definition which is there in bill as per section 7? It says subsection 1 clause A is same. It says all forms of supply such as sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease or disposal, made or agreed to be made for a consideration by a person in course or furtherance of business. Clause B, again it is same. It says that importation of service for a consideration whether or not in course or furtherance of business. Both are same. Clause C, again it is same. Supply is specified in schedule 1, which is without a consideration. So my dear friends, so far as the first 3 clauses of subsection 1 is concerned, it is similar to subsection 1 of section 3 as we have discussed earlier. Now there is clause D which has been inserted, and clause D says schedule 2 shall apply for determining what is or what is to be treated as supply of goods or supply of service. Again my dear friends, you might be remembering there was subsection 2 to section 3 which was providing the same thing. So what they have done is they have deleted that subsection 2, and that subsection 2 is now made clause D of subsection 1 simply. So let us see, is there any change in schedule 1 or schedule 2? This is schedule 1. Item number 1 says permanent transfer, disposal of business assets where input tax credit has been availed on such assets. It is same. This we have discussed earlier also. It is same. There is no change as such. The same we have discussed in schedule 1 of model GST law. Now point number 2, there is change. There is a change in point number 2. It says that supply of goods or services between related persons. Supply of goods or services between related persons or between distinct persons as specified in section 25 when made in course or furtherance of business. So when any supply of goods or services is there between the related persons or between two distinct persons as specified in section 25, if made in course or furtherance of business, then it will be treated as supply. But it is providing something. It says that provided that gifts not exceeding 50,000 in value in a financial year by an employer to an employee shall not be treated as supply of goods or services or both. See, up till now there was one thing which was clear, that if an employer is providing any fringe benefit to an employee, it was getting covered under the definition of supply. But now they say that if a gift is there which is not exceeding 50,000 rupees in a financial year by an employer to an employee, then it will not be treated as supply of goods or services or both. Then it is not to be treated as supply. Item number 3, it is same. There is no change as such. Supply of goods by a principal to his agent, where the agent undertakes to supply such goods on behalf of the principal, or by an agent to his principal, where agent undertakes to receive such goods on behalf of the principal. It is one and the same. And then point number 4, again it is same. There is no change as such. Importation of service by a taxable person from a related person or from any other establishment outside India in course or furtherance of business. So we have discussed this earlier also, that there is a contradiction when we see the provision of clause B of subsection 1 of section 7. We see that importation of service for a consideration in whether or not in course or furtherance of business, that is covered under the term supply. And here it says importation of service by a taxable person from a related person or any of his establishments outside India in course or furtherance of business. It means even if it is without consideration, it will be included in the definition of supply, provided it is in course or furtherance of business. Now let me move ahead to schedule 2. We have discussed schedule 1 except point number 2, which deals with a gift not exceeding 50,000 rupees by an employer to an employee in a financial year is not to be treated as supply of goods or services. Rest everything is same that we have discussed in model GST law. Now what about schedule 2, whether there is any change or not? If I ask a question whether you remember what was there in schedule 2, I am expecting a right answer, and the answer is the schedule 2 is about classification. It classifies a transaction or an activity whether it is to be treated as supply of goods or whether it is to be treated as supply of service. So that is schedule 2, and let us see what does it provide as clause D of subsection 1 of section 7. These are 7 contents which is getting covered under schedule 2. One is transfer, land and building, how transfer is to be treated, how land and building is to be treated, how the treatment or process, any treatment or process which is applied in another person's goods is a supply of service or not, transfer of business assets, supply of services, composite supply and supply of goods. It means when a transfer will be treated as supply of goods or service, when a land or building, whether it is going to be transfer, whether it is going to be supply of goods or services, that is covered under schedule 2. So now let us see schedule 2 in detail so as to get more clarity. And my dear friends, there are not much changes, but then also it will be a revision also. So let us have a look on this. In case of transfer, it says any transfer of title in goods is a supply of goods. Clause B says any transfer of right in goods or of undivided share in goods without transfer of title thereof is supply of service. It means if you are transferring a right in goods or undivided share in goods without transferring the title then in that situation it becomes supply of service and not the supply of goods. And clause C says any transfer of title and goods under an agreement which stipulates that property and goods shall pass at a future date upon payment of full consideration as agreed is a supply of goods. If you are entering into an agreement wherein you are putting a clause that once the final payment is made, then the property will be transferred to the other person, then it becomes supply of goods. Second point is land and building. It says any lease, tenancy, easement, license to occupy land is a supply of service. I am repeating in case of land and building because this is something which we all are concerned of, whether there will be GST in case of construction or not, whether GST is going to be made applicable in case of construction or booking of construction or not, as it is applicable as on date, whether after receiving the BUC or the certificate from the local authority, whether that will be treated as supply of goods or services or not. These are the questions which we all are concerned of. And it says in case of lease, tenancy, easement or license to occupy a land, it will be supply of service. That means renting will be supply of service. Further it says any lease or letting out of a building including a commercial, industrial or residential complex for business or commerce either wholly or partly is again a supply of service. It means land and building, whether land is leased out or building is leased out, both are to be treated as supply of service. Third point, it says treatment or process. Any treatment or process which is applied to another person's goods is a supply of service. Job work. If somebody is sending you certain goods and asking you to apply certain processes on the same, whether that is a testing process or whether that is a part of manufacturing process, it will be treated as supply of service. Transfer of business assets. Point number 4. It says clause A, where goods forming part of the assets of a business are transferred or disposed of by or under the directions of a person carrying on the business so as no longer to form part of those assets, whether or not for a consideration, such transfer or disposal is a supply of goods by a person. So such transfer or disposal is supply of goods by the person. It is not supply of service. I am repeating again. It says where the goods which are forming part of assets of a business are transferred or disposed of by or under the directions of the person who is carrying on the business so as no longer to form part of those assets. Those are supplied in such a form that those are not going to be forming part of those assets. Whether or not for a consideration, such transfer or disposal is a supply of goods by a person. Clause B, where by or under the direction of a person carrying on a business, goods held or used for the purpose of the business are put to any private use or are used or made available to any person for use for any purpose other than a purpose of the business, whether or not for a consideration, the usage or making available of such goods is a supply of service. It is not a supply of goods. What we are trying to understand is transfer of business assets, when it will be treated as supply of goods and when it will be treated as supply of service. So it simply says where by or under a direction of a person who is carrying on a business, goods which are held or used for the purpose of business are put to any private use or are used or made available to any person for use for any purpose which is not related to business. Then whether consideration is involved or not, the usage or making available of such goods is supply of service. It means some business assets are being used for private purposes by a person which is not related to business purpose, then in that situation it will not be treated as supply of goods, it will be treated as supply of service. Clause C, it says where any person ceases to be a taxable person, any goods forming part of assets of any business carried on by him shall be deemed to be supplied by him in course or furtherance of his business immediately before he ceases to be a taxable person. It means in case of transfer of business assets, whenever a person is ceasing to be a taxable person, that means he is no longer a taxable person. Maybe by virtue of closure of business, maybe by virtue of his turnover getting less than 20 lakhs, but now he is not a taxable person. Then in that situation, see, the definition of taxable person is again changed. In model GST law, we have seen that the taxable person is defined under section 10. But in case of bill, section 10 does not relate to taxable person. Now they have simplified the term taxable person. Any person who is liable to get himself registered under the act is a taxable person. Simple. There is no other meaning, there is no other word. So if he ceases to be a taxable person, then any goods which form part of the assets of any business which he was carrying on, and it shall be deemed to be supplied by him in course or furtherance of business immediately before. Automatically it will be presumed that those assets are supplied by him in course or furtherance of business before he ceases to be a taxable person. Unless, it means in this situation this is not going to happen. Number one, the business is transferred as a going concern to another person. If that happens, then in that situation, if because of transfer of business as a going concern to some other person, he ceases to be a taxable person, then it cannot be assumed that he has supplied those business assets in course or furtherance of business. Second, the business is carried on by a personal representative who is deemed to be a taxable person. It means now he is not carrying on the business, and because of that he is not carrying on, he becomes a non-taxable person. But he has appointed a representative who will be carrying on such business, then that person will be deemed to be a taxable person. And in that situation, the other person will be liable, and he will not be liable under this clause. So point number 5, my dear friends, it says supply of services. We all might be remembering that there were certain clauses pertaining to supply of service in Schedule 2, renting of immovable property, construction, works contract, supply of food, article or drink for human consumption. These were certain things which we have discussed earlier also, and which is there in the service tax as declared services 66E. More or less it has been continued in the bill also, but there are certain changes. Let us see what those changes are. Now, number 1 is renting of immovable property. It means similar provision that is there in service tax, it will be treated as supply of service. Construction of a complex building, civil structure or part thereof, including a complex or building intended for sale to a buyer, wholly or partly, except where the entire consideration has been received after issuance of completion certificate where required by competent authority, or after its first occupation, whichever is earlier. Simple. What is there in the current law in service tax? The same provision they have copied and pasted. It says any construction of a complex building, civil structure, which is wherein the person who is constructing is intending to sell it to a buyer, whether wholly or partly, it will be covered under supply of service. Only exception is there where the entire consideration, it means entire consideration, not even a single rupee should be received before the completion certificate. If the entire consideration is received after the consideration, then it will be out of service tax preview or supply of service. Otherwise, it will be treated as supply of service. Clause C, temporary transfer or permitting the use or enjoyment of any intellectual property right. If you are handing over or transferring your intellectual property right, may that be a trademark or a copyright, for a time being on a temporary basis, then in that situation it becomes a supply of service. Development, design, programming, customization, adaptation, upgradation, enhancement, implementation of information technology service or software. That is again supply of service. Agreeing to the obligation to refrain from an act or to tolerate an act or situation or to do an act. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Yeah. Agreeing to the obligation to refrain from an act. If you are agreeing of refraining from an act, or you are agreeing to tolerate an act or a situation, or you are agreeing to do an act, in all these situations it will be treated as supply of service. And then transfer of the right to use any goods for any purpose. It says any goods for any purpose, for cash, deferred payment or other valuable consideration. If you are doing this, if you are transferring the right to use of any goods for any purpose, whether it is specified or not, for cash, deferred payment or other valuable consideration, then in that situation it will be treated as supply of service. Now what is composite supply? Point number 6. We all know what is composite supply, but here it means works contract. Composite supply, otherwise we have already seen the definition of the same. We will be seeing it today again, but composite supply here means works contract. The following composite supply shall be treated as supply of service, namely, number 1, works contract as defined in clause 119 of section 2, that will be treated as supply of service. And second, supply by way of or as part of any service or in any other manner whatsoever of goods, being food or any other article for human consumption, or any drink other than alcoholic liquor for human consumption, where such supply of service is for cash, deferred payment or other valuable consideration, it will be treated as supply of service. And last is supply of goods. The following shall be treated as supply of goods, namely, supply of goods by any unincorporated association or body of persons to a member thereof for cash, deferred payment or other valuable consideration. Any supply of goods by an unincorporated association or body of persons to its member for cash, deferred payment or other valuable consideration will again be treated as supply of goods. So now let us come back to the presentation. So this is what we have discussed, schedule 2. More or less, I would not say it is similar, but more or less it is similar to what we have discussed in section 3, subsection 2. Schedule 2 classifies an activity or a transaction whether it is to be treated as supply of goods or supply of service. Now moving further, subsection 2. Subsection 2 says, notwithstanding anything contained in subsection 1, activities or transactions is specified in schedule 3. Activities or transactions is specified in schedule 3, or activities or transactions undertaken by central government, state government or any local authority in which they are engaged as public authority as may be notified by government on the recommendation of the council. If these two situations are there, it means activities or transactions which are specified or covered under schedule 3, or activities or transactions which are undertaken by central government or state government or any local authority in which they are engaged as a public authority and which are notified, and those activities or transactions are notified by the government on recommendation of the council, then such activities or transactions shall be treated neither as a supply of goods nor as a supply of service. It means that will be out of tax preview or purview. That is not going to be covered for the purpose of taxation, irrespective of the fact that it will fall within the definition or scope of term supply. Now subsection 3. Just a minute, somebody has raised hands. Subsection 3 says, Central government or state government may, on recommendation of the council, by notification specify as is goods or services. Earlier also the similar kind of provision was there as subsection 4, and the provision was that central government or state government may come out with a notification and prescribe certain activities or transactions which will be treated as supply of goods, not the supply of service, or supply of service, not the supply of goods, or neither the supply of goods nor the supply of service. But now it has been amended and it says that central government or state government, on recommendation of the council, by way of notification, may specify the transactions which are to be treated as supply of goods and not a supply of service, or supply of service and not a supply of goods. So that is covered under subsection 3 of section 7. Now let me touch upon schedule 3 of section 7, and it says the transactions or activities which are specified in schedule 3 and which will not be treated as supply of goods or supply of services. Number 1, services by an employee to the employer in course of or in relation to his employment. It means any service by an employee will never be taxable under GST. Second, services by any court or tribunal established under any law for the time being in force. Services by any court or tribunal established under any law for the time being in force. Any such service will not be taxable as supply of goods or supply of services. Now here one explanation is also provided in the schedule at the end of point number 6, and that explanation says that term court here means lower court, district court, high court and supreme court. All the courts are included in the term court. Point number 3, it says the functions performed by member of parliament, state legislature, panchayat, municipalities and other local authorities, all those functions shall not be treated as supply of goods or supply of services. No, nothing, no tax will be there. The duties which are performed by any person who holds any post in pursuance of the provisions of the constitution in that capacity, or the duties performed by any person as a chairperson, member, director in a body established by the central government or state government or local authority and who is not deemed as an employee before the commencement of this clause, then in that situation also schedule 3 is applicable, and such transaction or activity will neither be treated as supply of goods nor supply of service. Point number 4, services of funeral, burial, crematorium or mortuary, including the transportation of deceased. Now these 4 were there in schedule 3 as per the revised model GST law, but 5th and 6th they have added. And what is that? It says sale of land, and subject to clause B of paragraph 5 of schedule 2. We have read paragraph 5 also. Subject to clause B, that is construction, of paragraph 5 of schedule 2, sale of building. So it means sale of land, and subject to clause B of paragraph 5, it means sale of building after getting the completion certificate will be out of supply of goods or supply of service. So sale of land out of taxable purview. Sale of building after the BOC or completion certificate out of taxable purview. 6th point, actionable claims other than lottery, betting or gambling. You all might remember that we have discussed the definition of goods and services. In the definition of goods, it says that every movable item will be covered under the definition goods except money, and includes actionable claims. So that actionable claim other than lottery, betting or gambling, it means if it is lottery, betting or gambling, then only it will be included in the term goods. Otherwise it's not going to be included in the term, and there will be no levy of GST. Now moving ahead. Now my dear friends, we have discussed the term supply which is there as per the bill that has been passed by the Lok Sabha in March on Friday, and therefore it has been now condensed into three subsections, which earlier were into 5 subsections. And what they have done is, subsection 2 they have merged as clause D with subsection 1. Subsection 2 they have merged. Subsection 3 is subsection 2. Subsection 4 is subsection 3. And subsection 5, which was pertaining to composite supply or mixed supply, is now section 8. So now let us move and see the provisions of section 8, which is tax liability on composite and mixed supply. Again, you all might remember what is composite supply. We have seen an example that you have purchased certain goods along with the insurance, that becomes a composite supply, wherein it is naturally bundled, and amongst those two or more supplies, one supply is a principal supply. That was the composite supply. And principal supply is similarly a dominating nature supply. A supply which is of dominant nature in the composite supply was the principal supply. And then mixed supply, wherein two independent items are bundled together and they are supplied together, it becomes a mixed supply. That means those are not naturally bundled. So let us see what is the provision under section 8 of the bill pertaining to taxability on composite and mixed supply. This is the definition of composite supply. We have already discussed, and this is same, no change there. Mixed supply, again, two or more individual supply of goods or services or any combination thereof which are made for a single price will be a composite supply. Mixed supply, sorry. And the principal supply, the supply of goods or services which constitutes the predominant element of a composite supply, will be a principal supply. So these definitions we have already seen. The only change is there. Earlier these definitions were covered under section 2 subclause some other subclause, and now those are covered under subclause 30, 74 and 90. Now let us see the exact provision. What is the exact provision of taxability? What was the provision there earlier? Can you remember? The provision was, in case of composite supply of goods or services, the rate will be applicable, the rate that is applicable to the predominant nature supply, that is principal supply, will be applicable. And in case of mixed supply, the highest rate which is there of any of the items will be applicable to the entire supply. The same principle is there in section 8, which is now there covering in the bill. They say tax liability on composite and mixed supply shall be determined in the following manner. In case of composite supply, one of which is principal supply shall be treated as supply of such principal supply, and therefore the rate will be applicable of principal supply. And in case of mixed supply, shall be treated as supply of that supply which attracts the highest rate of tax. So more or less subsection 5 of section 3 is now section 8, but the provisions are same. The definition of composite supply, the definition of principal supply, the definition of mixed supply, all these three are same, and the manner in which the tax has to be calculated is also the same. That in case of composite supply, it will be principal supply's rate, and in case of mixed supply, it will be highest rate of tax of the items involved. So now let me move ahead to the next section, and that is levy and collection of tax. Earlier it was section 8 which was discussing the provisions pertaining to levy and collection of tax. Now that is section 9. And you might remember that we have read with a simple provision which says that there shall be levied a tax known as central goods and services tax on the intra-state supply made by a person at the rate not exceeding 14% on the value determined as per section 15. That was what we have read earlier. And what is there in section 9 now? It says there shall be levied a tax called CGST, that is Central Goods and Services Tax, on all intra-state supplies except on the supply of alcoholic liquor for human consumption. This is something that they have added. Earlier this was not there. It was only on all intra-state supplies. Now they have added on all intra-state supplies except on the supply of alcoholic liquor for human consumption, because this is out of GST. On the value that is determined under section 15, it is same, and at such rates as may be notified, not exceeding 20%. So earlier we have read with 14%, and there is long debate which has happened, 7 hours debate, in which one of the important debates was that the highest rate that has been fixed under GST is 28%. The four rates you might be remembering: 5%, 12%, 18%, and 28%. The highest rate that is fixed is 28%. So how come the highest rate in IGST Act is taken as 40%, and the 14% rate which was there in revised model GST law, how come that has been taken as 20%? Why that has been done? What is the purpose of doing this? That was something which was deliberated on in Lok Sabha before clearance of this bill. So what they have done is they have mentioned it not exceeding 20% and collected in such manner as may be prescribed. Subsection 2 says, which is a new subsection, I would say, this was not there in earlier, or that section 8 was not covering this clause, and it says that central tax on supply of petroleum, crude, high speed diesel, motor spirit which is commonly known as petrol, natural gas, and aviation turbine fuel. In these 5 situations, the central tax shall be levied with effect from such date as may be notified by the government. It means these 5 items are covered under GST, but GST will not be made applicable from 1st July on them. It will be made applicable from the date to be notified by the government on recommendation of the council. Which are those 5 items? Petroleum crude, high speed diesel, aviation turbine oil, fuel, natural gas, and motor spirit which is commonly known as petrol. These 5 items are now out of GST for the time being, but the day when the council will recommend and the government will come out with a notification, it will be covered under GST, and the central goods and services tax will be made applicable on the same. Subsection 3, it is same as we have done earlier, or we have read earlier also. The central government may notify by notification category of supply of goods or services, the tax on which is payable on reverse charge basis by the recipient, and the provisions, all the provisions of this law which is applicable to the supplier of goods or services will be made applicable to the recipient in case he is covered under reverse charge. This is the same clause that we have discussed earlier also. Now this is something which is new and which is dangerous. I am repeating, this is something which is new and a dangerous provision. It says that whenever you are purchasing from a person who is a non-registered person, whenever you are purchasing goods or services from a non-registered person, you will be made liable on reverse charge basis. That means as a recipient of those goods or services which you are purchasing from a non-registered or unregistered person, you will be made liable for payment of tax which is CGST, SGST, IGST under the reverse charge, and all the provisions of this law which is applicable to that supplier will be made applicable to you. This provision was not there. Now they have inserted this as subsection 4 to section 9, and for me and to my understanding, this is something which is very crucial, and this is going to be, or this is going to have an impact when GST will be implemented. And therefore we say that most of the persons will have to take registration under GST, because if they will not take, the other person will be made liable under reverse charge, and no one would like to do that. So therefore nobody will be purchasing or will be willing to purchase from an unregistered person, and therefore the unregistered person will have to suffer so far as business is concerned. Moving to the last subsection, it says that government may notify such category of service, tax on which shall be paid by electronic commerce operator. Electronic commerce operator is altogether a different chapter in the bill, in the GST law, and it has the provision of TCS, that is tax collected at source, and therefore it clearly says for levy and collection that the government may come out with certain specified category of goods or services, which if supplied through the electronic commerce operator, then the electronic commerce operator, where he has a physical presence in the taxable territory, then the electronic commerce operator will be liable. Otherwise, if he is not having the physical presence, then any person who is acting as his representative shall be made liable to pay tax. And in case both, that is electronic commerce operator, is not having a physical presence and neither he is having his legal representative there, then in that situation they will have to appoint a person as their representative, and he will be made liable to make payment as per this clause 5, subsection 5 of section 9. This provision was there in section 8 also. In case of electronic commerce operator, if any supplies are being made through it, then he is going to be made liable for paying tax. So simply, if I read, government may notify such category of service, tax on which shall be paid by the electronic commerce operator. If I am dealing with those goods or services which are notified by the central government, then the electronic commerce operator will be liable to make payment of tax. But in case it is not physically available, then his representative will be made liable. And if he is not there, as well as representative is also not there, in that situation he will have to appoint a person in the taxable territory for the purpose of paying tax, and such person will become liable to make the payment of tax. So this is something, a few changes that has been made under the levy section. And simply, if we note down, number 1 change is rate has been extended from 14% to 20%, and the term except on the supply of alcoholic liquor for human consumption has been added, number 1. Number 2, a subsection has been inserted which says petroleum crude, high speed diesel, motor spirit, natural gas and aviation turbine fuel will not be taxed unless the central government notify a date from which it is going to be taxed under GST. Then subsection 3 is same. Subsection 4 is inserted which says that if you are purchasing certain goods or services from an unregistered dealer, then in that situation you as a recipient will be made liable under reverse charge. So these are the 3 changes that has been made in the section pertaining to levy and collection under CGST. Now let us discuss about composition levy. We have seen that section 9 was there in the model GST law, which was having the provision pertaining to composition levy. But now it has been made section 10, which will be providing the definition or the provisions pertaining to composition levy. Before discussing the provisions of composition levy, I think we should take a break of 10 minutes, and then after the break there are 2 topics that we'll be covering today: composition levy and time of supply of goods and time of supply of services. That is what we are going to cover today. And in next session, that will be on 4th of April, we'll be covering all those topics that we have done, and we'll be comparing the same which was there in the model GST law and the bill, and then thereafter we'll move further to our new topics. So what we'll be doing in next session, it will be registration, it will be payment of tax procedures, it will be place of supply and the input tax credit. So next session again is going to be very crucial because there are many changes so far as registration is concerned, so far as place of supply is concerned, and the input tax credit. So please, next session is compulsory to be attended. For the time being, for 10 minutes, let me take a break. Thank you very much. Welcome back, my dear friends. Now we have to discuss section 10, provisions pertaining to composition levy. Now before going into the provisions which are there in the bill, let us revise once what was there in section 9 that we have discussed earlier. It simply said that if a person is not crossing a turnover of 50 lakhs, then he has an option of composition levy. He can get himself registered as a composition dealer, and therefore If he is a manufacturer, then 2.5% of the turnover will have to be paid by him. If he is not a manufacturer, then in that situation 1% was prescribed under the model GST law. And then there were 5 situations. If he was falling in those 5 situations, then he was out of the composition scheme automatically. That means he was not eligible for the composition scheme. If we try to recollect that, it was if he is engaged into supply of services, if he is engaged into supply of those goods which are not taxable under the act, if he is indulged into interstate supplies, or if he is indulged into those services which are notified, then in these situations he was not eligible for being registered as a composite dealer. So now let us go through whether there is any change in composition levy or not. Now, this is similar to what we have seen earlier. It says turnover if it is below 50 lakhs and he is satisfying those 5 situations, then he becomes eligible. And if he is complying with these 5 situations, any of the 5 situations he is satisfying, then in that situation he will be out of the composition levy. I am repeating again, if I am having a turnover of less than 50 lakhs, number 1, and at the same time I am not falling in any of those 5 situations which we are going to see, then we are eligible to get covered under composition levy. Otherwise we are not eligible to get covered under composition levy. This is what we have discussed earlier also. Now, what is the rate that is prescribed? Earlier the rate prescribed was 2.5% in case of manufacturer and 1% in case of others. And now it has been prescribed as 1% in case of manufacturer, 0.5% in case of others, and 2.5% in case of those persons which are covered in Schedule 2, point number 6, pertaining to composite supply of food articles or commodities or drinks other than alcoholic liquor for human consumption. It means if I am indulged into supply of food articles or drinks other than alcoholic liquor for human consumption, then I am eligible even though I am falling under supply of service. So the change is that they have made an exception. I am repeating, they have made an exception. Earlier what they were telling, 5 situations that he should not be indulged into supply of services. Now they have made an exception wherein they are telling that if they are engaged in supply of those services which pertains to supply of food articles or drinks other than alcoholic liquor, then they are eligible to be covered under composition levy provided their turnover is less than 50 lakhs, and the tax rate for them will be 2.5% of the turnover. So are you all clear about this? That in case of restaurant services, food supplies or drink supplies other than alcoholic liquors, the composition levy is open even if it is supply of service, and the rate is 2.5% which is applicable to them. So this is one change. Second change is now they have kept a cap wherein they have said that the limit of 50 lakhs turnover can be increased by the government, but it cannot be increased to more than 1 crore. This is something that they have provided specifically in the bill, in the law itself. Limit of 50 lakhs can be increased up to 1 crore maximum. So this is again a new thing that has been provided in this section, that is section 10 pertaining to composition levy. And these are the 5 situations which if any of these situations he will fall, he will be out of the composition levy. And if he is not complying with any of these, then yes, he will be covered under composition levy option. What are those? First and foremost, engaged in supply of services except supply of food for human consumption or any other drink other than alcoholic liquor. Why this is? Only reason is they have now given an option that in case of supply of service only, also if it is pertaining to supply of food articles or drinks, then composition levy is open. Second is supply of goods which is not taxable under this act. Third is engaged in interstate outward supply of goods. Fourth is engaged in supply of goods through e-commerce operator who is liable to TCS under section 52. Earlier it was this was section 56. Now it is section 52. And if he is manufacturer of the notified goods, if he is falling in any of these 5 situations, he will be out of composition levy. And then there are certain important points which we need to consider and keep in mind if we are going for an option of composition levy. Number 1, no permission of composition unless all taxable persons having same PAN also opt for composition levy. If there are 5 branches and 2 branches says that I will be following composition levy, 2 registrations and 3 registrations which are separately registered branches, they say that we will be out of composition levy, it's not possible. All those 5 branches which are registered separately must exercise the option of composition levy, then only this is available. Second is no tax to be collected from recipient. If you are opting for composition levy, you cannot collect any tax from the recipient. No entitlement of input tax credit. You are not entitled for any input tax credit. If proper officer has the reason to believe that the person is not eligible under section 10, in addition to any tax, he can also levy penalty as per the provisions of section 73 and 74. Earlier it was section 66 or 67, now it is 73 and 70 or 74. And last is the day aggregate turnover crosses. This again is a new provision which has been inserted specifically in section 10. If any day the aggregate turnover crosses 50 lakhs, the option of composition will lapse. Automatically he will come out of the composition scheme. It's very natural and logical. So my dear friends, these were certain changes in composition levy. Number 1, rate. Rate has been now changed. It is 1% for manufacturer, 0.5% for others and 2.5% for supplier of food articles or drinks. Then another change is there is a cap now of 1 crore rupees. Only the limit of turnover can be increased to 1 crore. It cannot be made 2 crores for composition. Number 3, the change is that the day the aggregate turnover crosses 50 lakh rupees or the limit is specified, may that be 1 crore up to the maximum extent of 1 crore rupees, they will come out of the composition scheme. That means the option will lapse automatically. So these are certain changes which are there in the composition levy. Now moving ahead, time of supply of goods. You all might be remembering that there were 5 subsections pertaining to time of supply of goods. Let me take 1 minute and explain those 5 subsections, revise those 5 subsections. Subsection 1 was saying the liability to pay central goods of service tax or state goods of service tax shall arise at the time of supply as determined as per the provisions of this section. Subsection 1. Subsection 2 said earliest of the following will be time of supply of goods: date of issuance of invoice by the supplier, last date on which the invoice is supposed to be issued, or the date of receipt of payment. Earliest of these 3 dates will be the time of supply of goods. Subsection 3 was pertaining to reverse charge, and there were 3 dates. Earliest of the 3 was time of supply of goods. Which were those? The date of receipt of goods, the date of payment, and immediately next day of lapse of 30 days of issuance of invoice. Whichever is earlier will be treated as supply of goods. Subsection 4 was pertaining to vouchers, and it said that if vouchers are identifiable at that point of time, then the date of issuance of voucher is time of supply, and if it is not identifiable, then the date of redemption of voucher is the time of supply. And subsection 5 was in case where the periodical return, that was the residuary section, and it said that in case the periodical return is supposed to be filed, then the date on which it is to be filed, and in case there is no periodical return requirement, then in that situation the date on which the CGST or SGST is paid will become the time of supply of goods. Hope you all remember this. And now we have to see whether there are any changes in provisions pertaining to time of supply of goods. Believe me friends, Wherever there are changes, I have covered that, and only those sections we are going to discuss again where there are some changes, maybe a minor change or maybe a major change. Subsection 2, date of issuance of invoice by the supplier, it's same. Last date on which he is supposed to issue the invoice in respect of supply, again it is same. And date of receipt of payment with respect to supply, it is same. Subsection 2 is same as it was earlier, but there is a change in subsection 3. The 3 dates. Earlier the provision was date of receipt of goods, date on which payment is made, and immediately next day succeeding day of 30 days of issuance of invoice. What is the provision now? It says that date of receipt of goods, it is same. Date of payment is entered in the books, or date of debit of payment in the bank account, whichever is earlier. Date of payment as entered in the books of accounts, or the date of debit of payment in the bank account, whichever is earlier, is second date. Earlier it was date of payment. Now what date of payment? Now it clarifies that whether a date on which you have debited in your books of accounts, or the date when it is debited in your bank account, whichever is earlier will be the date of payment, and the date immediately following 30 days of invoice, this is the same. So either of these 3 dates, earliest of the 3 dates, will be time of supply of goods. And there was a proviso which said that in case it cannot be determined as per the above 3 dates, then the date on which the recipient has recorded the same in his books of accounts will be the time of supply of goods. Subsection 4, this is same, that is vouchers. If it is identifiable at the point of time when it is getting issued, then the date of issuance of voucher. If it is not identifiable, then in that situation the date of redemption will be the time of supply of goods. Subsection 5, again same, periodical return where to be filed, date of filing of periodical return, date on which it is to be filed, and in case no periodical return is to be filed, then the date on which CGST or SGST is paid. Now subsection 6 has been inserted. This is a new subsection, and it says that the time of supply, to the extent it relates to any addition in value of supply by way of interest, late fee or penalty for delayed payment of any consideration. For delayed payment of any consideration, it means you have entered into a contract for making a payment of 1 lakh rupees, and now because you have delayed that payment, you will have to pay interest, late fee or any penalty, and because of that the value of supply has increased. Then in that situation, the time of supply of goods will be the date on which the supplier receives such additional value. It means the date on which you will receive such interest, fine or penalty will be the time of supply of goods. So this is something which has been added in section 12 in time of supply of goods. It means the case where the value of supply is getting increased or affected by way of interest, late fee or penalty, and that is imposed on you because you have delayed in making the payment of consideration, then such amount will impact your value of supply, and therefore on that value the time of supply of goods will be determined as the date on which the supplier is receiving the addition in the value. That will be the time of supply of goods. Moving further, time of supply of services. As you all might be aware, and you might remember, what was the provision in time of supply of service? Again there were 3 dates. Subsection 1, it was same, that the liability to pay tax as CGST or SGST shall arise at the time of supply of service as determined in this section. Subsection 2 was earliest of the 3 dates, date on which invoices be issued, last date on which invoice was supposed to be issued, and third was date of receipt of payment. But the said condition, this subsection has been changed in case of supply of service. Please remember the provision that is there in Point of Taxation Rules 2011 so far as service tax is concerned. It says that you will have to issue an invoice within a duration of 30 days from the date of provision of service, and in case you fail to do that, then the date of provision of service will be treated as point of taxation. So similar kind of provision now they have inserted in section 13, which pertains to time of supply of service. Let us see that. It says that invoice issued within the time limit. It means within 30 days. That has been prescribed in the draft rules, which we have already seen. If the invoice is issued within the time limit, then in that situation the date of issuance of invoice by the supplier or the date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. I am repeating, if the invoice has been issued within the time limit, that is of 30 days, then the date of issuance of invoice by the supplier or the date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier, will be the time of supply of service. Second situation can be where the invoice is issued after the time limit, and in that case it will be date of issue of provision of service. It means the date of provision of service or the date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. It means the date on which you have provided the service or on which the service is completed, that date, or the date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. And last is date on which recipient shows the receipt of service in his books of accounts. That will be treated as time of supply of service. I am repeating once again for the benefit of you all. If the invoice is issued within the time limit, the date of issuance of invoice or the date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. If it is not issued within the time limit, then the date of provision of service or the date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. And third is the date on which recipient shows or records the receipt in his books of accounts. That will be the time of supply of service. And in case this is the same provision, in case you are receiving an extra up to the extent of 1,000 rupees, then you have an option as a supplier, you have an option whether to make the payment of tax at the time of receipt of that extra amount up to the extent of 100 rupees or 1,000 rupees, or you can postpone that liability at the time for the time of supply of such goods or services. Now next, subsection 3, which pertains to reverse charge. It says date of receipt of goods. I'm sorry, I think this has been this is an error. It cannot be date of receipt of goods. It has to be date of payment as entered in books of accounts or date of payment in bank account. Date of payment as entered in books of accounts or date of payment in bank account, whichever is earlier, or the date immediately following 60 days of invoice. It's not 30 days. It's again an error. It has been an error of copy paste. First is date of payment as entered in the books of accounts or date of payment in bank account, whichever is earlier. Second is date immediately following 60 days of invoice. And when it is not determinable as per above, then the time of supply of service will be the date of entry in the books of accounts of recipient. It's same provision, only the difference is date of receipt of goods is not there. Next is I think here it has been corrected. Date of payment as entered in the books of accounts or date of payment in bank account. And second is date immediately following the 60 days. This is the right one. And next is one has been missed here, that is pertaining to vouchers. It has been, the provisions are same. If it is identifiable at the point of time when the vouchers are being issued for supply of service, then the date on which it is issued, and if it is not identifiable, then the date on which it is redeemed. Now subsection 5, where periodical return, there is a residuary section where the periodical return is supposed to be filed, then the date on which it is to be filed, and in case it is not to be filed, then the date on which the CGST or SGST is paid. And last, again subsection 6 has been inserted in section 13 also, which says that the time of supply to the extent it relates to in an addition in the value of supply by way of interest, late fee or penalty for delayed payment of any consideration shall be the date on which supplier receives such addition in value. So this we have discussed earlier, and with this I believe we have touched upon the scheduled portion of the day, and now we have to move towards the question and answers. So let us take 2 to 3 minutes. Please send all your questions, and then we will be addressing all those questions one by one. And again I am announcing Next session will be very important because in that session we are going to compare the provisions which are pertaining to registration, payment of tax, place of supply and input tax credit. All those four important provisions will be comparing with the revised model GST law and the bill that has been passed by the Lok Sabha. And then thereafter in next session we will be starting new topic on the basis of the bill that has been